Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Emma Maslen. I'm the CEO of inspir'em, and today I'm going to be joined by the lovely Eric Webb, who's going to be talking to us about mutual success plans. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the lovely Eric Webb, who's joining us today. I'm so delighted to have Eric on today's webinar. My little story about Eric before we get started and get Eric to introduce himself. So Eric worked for me as head of pre-sales when I was at SAP Concur. And I always thought it was very interesting that whilst sales structure is always something that we assume that salespeople are very interested in, I'm sure Eric will talk today about the fact that pre-sales very much enjoy when sales get some structure. So Eric, do you want to give us a little bit of introduction to yourself and your background, and we'll get into some questions about, yeah, go for it.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, it is good to see you again. And we do like our structure. Pre-sales, sales is part of that, and understanding how we can align and structure how deals and how sales is actually run is something as a leader is absolutely key for me personally speaking. Just a bit of background. I've been in solution consulting pre-sales for the better part of 15 plus years. I've been with Concur over 20 years now. I'm sure you could tell from my accent. I'm from the United States, but I've lived in the UK the past 11 years. I'm currently residing as our global leader for the solution consulting pre-sales team for SAP Concur.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Eric. And actually, I think that's one of the reasons why we've had so much interest about the webinar today, because I think, again, there's a lot of assumptions about some of these things like close plans, mutual success plans, structure, qualification, all of those sorts of things. Very interesting for sales, of course it should be, but of course really, really important for pre-sales. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about that first of all, and let's talk about mutual success plans. So you've been a very senior leader within SAP, and we talk about mutual success plans being imperative for forecast control. What's your perspective on that in terms of how important mutual success plans are in terms of internal and external communication?
I think they are imperative to understanding how you actually have a in control forecast. So as you're a sales leader, as you go up the chain, it's a little more difficult the more sales reps you have in your remit to make sure that they are accurately forecasting so that when you roll it up to your leaders, you're submitting an accurate forecast that you believe is actually going to close within a few percent, typically speaking. If you dial it into the pre-sales perspective, the lens, obviously I'm commissioned on deals closing, so I've got skin in the game. How do I make sure that the forecasting, if a sales rep says it's going to be on this date or this quarter, what have you, that it is actually going to come in. More importantly, it's for me to be able to align the resources to support that. And what I mean by that is, if we've got 15 deals and 15 deals are forecast for this particular quarter, there's a lot of work that typically has to go into all of that. So understanding what the mutually success plan is will allow us to understand where is the resource allocation going to be going, which deal of those 15 deals do we need to put who on at a particular time, because if everybody's asking for the same resource, we have a finite number of team members. How do we spread across 15 particular deals if everybody's trying to do the same thing at the same time? So a success plan is basically a project plan that is mutually agreed with the customer so that we can test them out and continually qualify. Is this an accurate forecast? Are we going to close it when we say we're going to close it, or is it potentially going to slip? Are there risks that we need to evaluate? And how do we start to move our chess pieces around so that we are de-risking that, or we know that it's going to be pushed out and we can pull something in hopefully to cover that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think particularly if we're thinking about some of those big enterprise deals, which are the deals that we worked on, our teams worked on together, when an economic buyer has said, yes, let's get something done, when you start to think about what's got to happen to the close, yes, there's lots of activity for the salespeople. You've got procurement and legal conversations to have and all of the order processing type stuff. But particularly in our sort of environment, there were things like DPA checks needed to be done, SLAs needed to be understood, statements of work and services agreements needed to be agreed. And absolutely, like you say, there is resource required, technical resource that's required. And that needs to be we need to be careful about how we deploy that resource. And
Mhm.
also from a forecasting perspective, making sure that they can see that coming down the line as well, so we can predict that. So very, very important to do that. And the earlier we can get ahead of that, the better it is from a resourcing perspective. But I've got a question though, which we get asked quite a lot. And if anybody has any questions today, feel free to put them in the chat. So, we talk about a mutual success plan, and we are talking about, typically we would operate on the similar type of spreadsheet that we use as a template today. What are your thoughts on, is that for every deal? Because we get asked that a lot. Are we talking about doing a mutual success plan in that format for every deal? Any particular thoughts there?
Yes. I think a success plan is required for every deal. Now, how robust that particular success plan is going to be, I think it depends on the size, the complexity, the strategic elements of that specific deal. So if it's a lower value, likely close, faster to close type opportunity, then it's probably going to be a less robust, maybe using email. What are the certain set of questions that must be asked and answered, all the way up to the big strategic, a lot more zeros in that particular opportunity. Then you're going to want a very robust understanding of what is it that we need to be ticking as we go along so that we are de-risking, we are continually qualifying, and we know that when we say this is going to close on X date, that our customers on board with that, and the economic buyer, the signatory, is going to be in office and not on holiday, and we're actually going to bring that in on time.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And again, we get asked this quite a lot, which is, do you have to have the spreadsheet? Do you have to have all of the lines in the spreadsheet? If you're doing a 10K deal, then, maybe you don't go to those lengths. But however, like you say, you're going to do that anyway. You're going to do that in any great sales rep's going to put that in email, which is, we've had a meeting, we've agreed these actions. That's the next part of the close plan anyway. So you are going to do that. It's just maybe the format is going to be sort of slightly different.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
think one of the things that I'd like to add to that, Emma, is the fact that my experience on the sales side of it is we assume that the customers are going based on our timelines. So in my world, we go on quarters, a lot of sales pressures around the end of the quarter.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
we've got to get this deal done by this date.
yeah,
And customers aren't necessarily aligned to that. In fact, they are aware that I might get a discount if I threaten that I'm not going to close the deal with them or mutually sign on a particular quarter end. So the better sales reps that I've worked with are cognizant of that,
mm,
don't necessarily drive their deals and their signatories around the end of a quarter. It's kind of I'm going to pick a date in the middle of the quarter. We're going to negotiate around good faith on that, and not I'm crunched at the end of the quarter. I need to get this done so I hit my quota.
yeah,
It's more of how do we design this so that the customer is in mind, understanding their timelines, facilitating their buying process, asking them qualifying questions that they need to go ask their own organization so that they can understand how to buy as well. Because my experience, a lot of the people we engage with aren't professional buyers. They need to build consensus. They need to work within their organization with people they've never worked with. And we have to educate them around how do you buy within your organization. And in doing that, you bring that into your success plan so that you are going to allow them to be successful and then yourself obviously to be successful as well
yeah,
within that. So it's I think it's very important to think about the other person, your customer, the individual in the organization, that it's not on your timeline. It's generally their timeline. How do you align them to
yeah.
to your timeline to be ultimately successful in what you're trying to achieve together?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of points I just want to pick up on what you've just mentioned there. So it is amazing how much of our pipeline sits on the last day of the quarter or the day before, because we think if we put it the day before the end of the quarter, that makes it look like we're not putting in for the end of the quarter. Of course we are. Um, there is the when we want to close it, that is one thing. There is when the customer needs it by, which is the why now, and actually working back from what do they need in terms of implementation and an outcome.
Mhm.
So what are they thinking in their mind about how long things take? But then there is the completely reverse engineering the timeline to think about, well, actually, how long does each one of these steps take? Because there's often a lot to do, and particularly in large strategic deals, like you've said, stakeholders that are involved, different departments are involved, business cases, finance approvals, and then you've got all of your negotiation that goes a bit in that.
Yeah.
There is a length of time, and you have to make sure that you're reverse engineering that as well to give yourself enough time. It's amazing how many times if you ask a salesperson, what's the significance of that close date? And they say, well, actually, I just put it in for that date and let's just see how we get on. We need to try and have some science around that to a certain degree, and mutual success plan absolutely gives that. So I want to move on to so some more about the sort of pre-sales and services side of things. We often say that the mutual success plan is very much led by the salespeople. Your teams have worked on very strategic deals in the past.
Yes.
Could you just talk to a little bit about how you would expect your pre-sales team, or maybe even some of the services teams, to be interacting with an AE around mutual success plans?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been driving over the last few years is moving the pre-sales function away from being a reactive function and more proactive. And part of that means understanding what's going on and an opportunity. And a mutual success plan is the perfect element to allow a solution consultant to evaluate what should I be doing in order to increase the velocity of this particular opportunity, such as we want to do these types of steps or these X, Y, and Z steps in our plan together. How do I start achieving this particular event? As a result, I can already book the next couple of steps with them, knowing that I've already reimbursed an engineer. These are the things that we want to do. So it allows each individual on our team to evaluate what is my workload. Our SCs support multiple reps. If we have a full understanding of what's going on in their world, they can start to proactively slide which deal they're going to work on and for what reason, so on and so forth. So it does really work in allowing for a proactive approach when the sales rep is saying, this is my close plan. This is what the customers agreed to. These are the things we have done. These are the things we haven't done. We need to accomplish. It allows us to pull in other resources as well. So we have technical reviews, security questionnaires that need to be done. Nothing better than 2 days before quarter end, and you get a 500 question security questionnaire, and that can absolutely stall a deal. And that's not what needs to stall a deal, because we
Yeah.
can. The services element is important because obviously success comes through the implementation. I can sell you something, but if you don't actually implement it and use it, then we haven't done anything. It's not bookable ARR, so on and so forth. So bringing services in to have those conversations of a statement of work potentially, or understanding like how fast do you need to go, where do you need to go, and how do we actually start to pre-build a project plan so that we're 2, 3, or 4 steps ahead when the actual project kicks off. That helps our customers be more likely to be successful faster, realize the value that we're positioning and agreeing to, so on and so forth. So these plans allow for a system thinking type event to happen where, yes, we're doing a deal together. We are going to achieve a certain element of value delivery for you as an organization through the business process we facilitate, but there are a lot of steps that need to happen ahead of that actually go live and using of the solution that we're selling you. So the plan allows for us to really allocate resources, like I said at the beginning of this conversation. How do I align the right people at the right time to come in and do the things that are going to increase our velocity, add more value as we go through it, remove barriers and roadblocks, continually de-risk our opportunity so that our customer isn't wasting their time and we're not wasting our own time thinking that we're going to get a deal done in the timeline we think we are.
Yeah.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
absolutely. And I think that, a couple of key things that you mentioned in there is like one is about getting ahead of the risks. Often I hear this all the time around, oh, the customer hasn't asked us for a security questionnaire, therefore I think we're okay. Okay, right. Well, maybe we might want to check so that we don't have that 2 days before the end of the quarter, or 2 days before our close date, even better, because let's hope it's not the end of the quarter. But also the acceleration as well of us being proactive. So I've seen a couple of really great reps that have worked for me in the past that have done things like the way that they've written the close plan so that it really drives urgency on the customer side. So things like introducing customer success and
Mhm.
onboarding conversations. So
Mhm.
then the customer starts thinking about, okay, so how do we get ahead of this? How do we think about some of the onboarding? Well, then you've got something to negotiate with the customer, because often customers say, well, actually, could we start some of the onboarding before we sign? Because, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get the paperwork done. Well, that gives you an opportunity to drive some urgency for sure. And playing in services and customer success around that can really drive that urgency. But often just having the dates in there and the things that you've got to get done, that in itself drives the urgency as well, because the customer realizes they're going to fast run out of time, and there should be a compelling event for them to get something done. So
Absolutely.
yeah, some great points in there for sure. Um, so what about so again, if anybody's got any questions, pop those in the chat. I'll keep going with some of the questions that we already have. What about best practices, do you think, Eric? What do you see great AEs or leaders doing, or even services or pre-sales people doing? What's the best of the best doing around things
Ah,
like close plan?
it's a good question. I mean, I mentioned systems thinking. I think we need to understand that our customer and our sales organization are acting as a joined system. Putting the customer first is imperative. Understanding the three whys. I mean, thank God I met you. You taught me about the three whys, and that is something on repeat with me these days. Really understanding, we're asking customers, we're asking human beings to change. And if we can't give them a definitive good reason to do that, then why are they going to go through the process of doing that? So you're doing something today this way. It works or it doesn't work, but we're asking you to do it differently. Do that now and do it with us. And it's imperative for us to make sure that we are bringing that into these plans, because we need to understand from the customer, how are we defining these reasons why you guys are organizationally going to change and part with your money to pay us, et cetera, et cetera. All super important. I think what works for me is making sure that we have a lined up systematic process of handing things over. Um, you're aware, we called it passing the baton or baton in the UK. And effectively, it is making sure that as we go through step one, step two, whatever it is, that baton is continually passed from person to person, from function to function, from us to customer, customer back, so on and so forth. And those are very imperative to understanding how you're going to achieve the success that you're trying to achieve. Now, in sales, obviously it's a closed one, but really it's helping that customer achieve the value that you're positioning and hopefully giving them. And through that, a successful implementation, a successful adoption and consumption of the service if you're selling software as a service, et cetera, et cetera, because ultimately that brings us back to being able to upsell, cross-sell, and so on and so forth. So, we've talked about pre-sales. It's more of an infinite sales because we're always in the process of selling. It might be the first time that we sold to them, so there is an act of pre-selling. Then we get into that act of servicing the customer to ensure that they're actually receiving the value of that, which ultimately gets us back into an element of pre-sales activity, which again, you bring in the question of, do we have the super robust Excel spreadsheet that is asking all the questions, et cetera, et cetera? Or do we have a less robust MSP because it's an upsell opportunity or cross-sell opportunity? I think kind of depends on the situation. You bring that back in, but again, it's kind of passing the baton as you go through and continually work with your customers.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think just to give a little bit of context um, about that, the relationships that were going on there. So, specifically one of the things that we'd previously worked on was, you've got sales that are initially driving the need. You've got pre-sales that are dipping into that. You're then going to have to do this handover to customer success and
Mhm.
services. And certainly in scenarios that we worked in the past, what would happen was that almost like everybody was in a linear chain. And the trouble was is if you were at the end of the chain, you didn't get the same information as if you were like the second link. So what was happening is as the baton was passed, less information was being filtered. And And then often what happened to our poor customer success people who were the backbone of the organization, who just got battered by customers constantly, the first conversation that they had was not a pleasant one, because often there was some sort of customer success disaster that had happened in the handing over of the baton, which meant the experience for the customer wasn't where they needed it to be. Maybe we'd forgotten their priorities, or maybe we just had, mishandled some of the relationships. So making sure that in some cases it's documentation, but in some cases it's just making sure that there's handover meetings or handoff meetings so that everybody that's in the customer chain, gives the customer the same experience. I often talk in training, just because I've got some ridiculous analogies about, it's almost like we date a customer, we book a church, and then we hand them off to marry someone else. That is not a great experience for our customers. So making sure that pre-sales becomes the backbone of that, because usually they're collecting a lot of that technical information and frankly better at documenting it than salespeople are. So sales to service, using pre-sales to hand over that baton, particularly as part of the mutual success plan, definitely worth including for sure.
I will tout one more thing. Not every organization has it, but most of them do if they're working in software these days. But an infosec or some sort of security conversation, integration conversation, you kind of touched on it a few minutes ago that it's lastminute.com. In my experience, the earlier you have that, if you know that these types of conversations are going to happen 9 times out of 10, get that done as early as possible, because that is either going to be the showstopper, which 9 times out of 10 it doesn't need to be. But if it is, great. You've not over invested and lost the deal at the last minute. You've gotten that out of the way early on. Okay, this is a showstopper. We're out. We'll go allocate our time elsewhere. That takes some of the stress off of the infosec people, the security people. That takes the lastminute.com type of activities that have to happen. It's no fun for somebody to have to answer a 500 question security questionnaire with 1 day to do that. And suddenly there's 2 or 3 of those. So it's, if you're thinking of the human elements, these people that are doing this job, that's very stressful for them. So how do you allow for them to have a less stressful job? Come do the important work that they are here for, and make sure that you're getting over that element so that you can actually progress and increase the velocity and so on and so forth. I mean, we had one of those recently with a big strategic deal, and it should have been a super easy conversation, but it got awkward because the person didn't like how he answered the question using the terminology that he did. And it was super awkward, and it didn't need to be, and the potential of that deal sliding didn't need to happen if we'd done it earlier. So these are some of the things that I would absolutely suggest you consider in your success plan. How do you get these types of things done? The big scary things to those of us who don't actually know all the technology and the integration and the words to use and security and privacy, so on and so forth. That's why those individuals have done all the training. Bring them in, have those conversations, done. Now we can go forward and get the business done.
Yep. I'd love to have a separate conversation with you, which I know many of the people who I know that on this webinar at the moment would enjoy, about do you respond to RFPs if you've had no engagement? But we'll leave that just hanging in the air because we can have that another time. There's a couple of questions that have actually come in. So just some quick fire answers on these. Okay. So Simone has asked a question, which is, what about a situation where you've asked a client about infosec questionnaires several times, they keep saying, no, one is not needed. They've then checked with their boss who've said, no, not needed. And you keep going down the road of no, not needed. And then all of a sudden it just pops up. What do you do in those types of situations?
I mean, I think it depends on the persona you're engaged with. So, I'm going to bounce this question back to you, Emma. Maybe you can give some suggestions around how do you work with the persona. In my experience, the buyers that we typically work with are from the business and don't necessarily understand or even know people within the technology side of the business. So, you ask some of the leading questions of, in my experience in working with other customers, these are the types of things that typically have to happen. And these are the types of people that we engage. So give them a little bit of an understanding that maybe you don't know your company and how it works. And that's totally understandable and when you get into big complex matrix organizations. But giving them an idea of who you might go talk to kind of reduces the stress and gets them over the little bit of fear of, I don't know if I'm actually, so I'll just say no. So give them the type of persona. Is it a CIO, CTO, somebody else, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe, nudge them that direction.
Yeah, I'd definitely be worried about champion track record for going through a process for sure, because that tells me that that they are unaware. The way that I'd flip that around is I would say that actually we have some infosec requirements, so we need to talk to that persona. So so that's an easy way to do it. Or you can ask a question about what is your infosec governance, who runs that, and then say, well, look, we need to speak to that person. So there's a couple of things that you can do to flip it around, but make it your requirement as part of the conversation. So you could do it that way. And
I
then,
think the answer in
yeah,
both of our answers is give them something to think about. Give them the words that they need to go say to somebody else.
yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. Okay. There are a couple of other suggestions that are in the chat that somebody's popped in as well. So worth having a look at what's in there. So unfortunately, we're out of time. But that was really useful, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, lots to think about. I don't know if you've got any final top tips for our team before we finish today.
I would suggest developing or using and leveraging an MSP 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. So particularly on the technical side of things, if your team members are not doing that, then get them started. We've got templates that are available. I think most of you know where those are. So, well, thanks very much for joining today, Eric. And thanks everybody that joined the webinar today.